Hello. I recently got the chance to chat with Stephen Baker, the designer behind HeroQuest, Battlemasters, Space Crusade, and many other games. We talked for a very long time over a couple of sessions. The first part of our retrospective interview is available on the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel right now, and you can check it out where we talk about HeroQuest and Space Crusade in great detail. But this interview goes into more detail about the creation of Battlemasters and the games that came after it. We talk about Stephen's time at Bluebird, where he worked on things like Polly Pocket and Mighty Max, and how that led to the creation of a game called Havoc, a skirmish-based miniature war game that used pre-painted miniatures and was released in toy stores. From there, we explore the creation of Heroscape, and many other games, and much more of Stephen's design philosophy for the creation of amazing board game experiences, how technology can play a role, and how innovation pushes the envelope forward to create fascinating new gameplay experiences. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and this is the second part of my retrospective interview with game designer Stephen Baker. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me again. We're going to talk some more about your amazing career, and we're going to touch on some of the games that we didn't get a chance to cover in much detail last time. So
Sure.
I think we'll probably start with Battlemasters. So we talked a little bit about it, but I suppose maybe we could explore the origins of that game.
Sure. Well, as you know, we had two games out prior to Battlemasters with both HeroQuest and Space Crusade. And both of those really dealt with kind of like more of a role-playing slash sort of skirmish level sort of experience in the world of Warhammer, and then obviously the world of Warhammer 40K. So if you look at the hobby, basically has got sort of four key pillars. You've got the sort of the role-playing slash skirmish gaming for fantasy and science fiction, and then you have their companion sort of tabletop miniature games for both themes as well. So the logical sort of next step was really to create a fantasy battle game. And as we've discussed, my sort of focus is always on that sort of theater of play, and how do you create something that is simple and accessible, but gives you the scale, the scope, and the spectacle of a full-blown miniatures game. So I had sort of three main goals. One is it had to be huge. I wanted to have 100 miniatures in the box. And I wanted to work through how to deal with movement. So, the one thing that many people stumble with when they first get into tabletop miniature gaming is just the whole process of moving and orientating figures and keeping units together, and wondering about sort of like facing and flanks and all the rest of it. And I wanted to sort of cut through all of that. And the easiest way is to basically have spaces, to have units that are essentially either in play or not in play. They can take wounds, but movement is just counted out on spaces. Everyone's comfortable with that. Everyone understands that. But of course, that meant that I needed a massive game board. And the original inspiration for it was a game called Torpedo Run, that was part of the Floor Wars series that was done by Milton Bradley back in the day. And it had this huge cardboard sort of game mat that you would fold out and put on the floor. And you then had ships and submarines that you lined up on either side. And the submarines fired little discs across the surface. And if they hit one of your opponent's ships, it would, spring off a gun turret or part of the superstructure. It was basically a skill and action game.
Right.
So my initial thought was, hey, I can have a game board just like that. But there were two problems. One, it wasn't a retail friendly box. It was this huge long box there'd been a lot of pushback from retailers, feeling that it was too big for shelves.
Mm.
And of course, a large cardboard game surface like that, is also expensive. It also had certain manufacturing challenges. So that's when I came up with the idea of, well, we print four colors on a twister mat. Maybe I can just do a full scale battlefield. And that was the direction that we went. The
Sure.
the original sort of intent had been to print a single image, but it turned out that the mats were actually printed on rollers, and the roller was only 65 centimeters circumference, so I had to have a repeating pattern.
Right.
So when you look at the Battle Masters mat, the reason that it's basically this sort of three repeats of essentially the same piece of artwork is because that was the manufacturing process that we had to kind of work with. Interestingly, we only found that out later on. So we had actually had a full piece of art done.
Right.
And up until a few years ago, I still had some samples of that printed on canvas, but unfortunately they were lost in a basement flood that I had a
Oh,
few years back.
oh,
But
it's a shame.
but yeah, it's kind of funny how how that goes, and a lot of people don't even necessarily immediately recognize
Mm.
that it's this repeating pattern. We tried to sort of come up with something that would mitigate the design, but it adds a nice little bit of flavor for the scenarios that we had.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works very well. It's a really good board. I mean, I'm just interested what you were saying there about the torpedo run and the sort of pushback on the scale of that box. The box for Battlemasters is pretty sizable. Was there any kind of pushback on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in today's world, you would not get a box like that placed at retail. So, um, and actually, Battle Masters, the box size, when you take the dimensions of the box face along with the height, it was actually the largest possible box that the European factories at the time could make. So
Wow.
it was really, at the limits of, of what was possible. But we wanted a big box face because, we just wanted that real estate for a great piece of art
Mm.
that would really, bring the whole thing to life. And there's a great piece of artwork there, very colourful, that really brings to life all of the characters in the game.
It does. Yeah, it's a fantastic box. And the contents of it. I mean, I think you're talking about the sort of accessibility in terms of design from okay, we're scaling up a board. So instead of scaling down a miniatures battle game so it fits on an existing board, we're going to scale the board up so the spaces are enormous and they fit an entire army. But you've also sort of scaled up the bases. So on HeroQuest, obviously, an individual miniature standing on an individual base. An
Sure.
entire unit is on one base in
Right.
Battle Masters as well. So, I mean, obviously, that's like an accessibility decision, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, I mean the main thinking there was, and anyone who plays tabletop gaming, understands that there's this sort of direct link between how much time it takes to play and how many miniatures you've got in play and how they're organized, right? So when you go back and you look at, the classic sort of war games rules from the 60s and the 70s, oftentimes all of the miniatures were single based. So moving a regiment of 20 figures, I mean, you just had to move every figure individually. I mean, it just takes a lot of time. It's just a simple case of sort of physics. So obviously, more commonly in today's world, unit figures are put onto sort of like movement bases that just sort of speeds up the movement, and that was exactly the thinking behind Battle Masters. It was like, we want this to be a fast-paced game, and once I flip a card and I know which units I can activate, I just want to be able to sort of like shunt them around quickly and get on with the game. So that was the thinking really behind the base. And we ended up trying to design a sort of a multi-use base that would work for all of the different unit configurations, which is why it has all of that sort of crisscross
Sure.
channels for, for the different setups.
Yeah, it's quite a. I mean, it's quite innovative. It's sort of like you say, multi-use slaughter base sort of technology, isn't it? You're taking what exists from Citadel Miniatures range and
Right.
applying it on a bigger scale.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it allowed us to have aspects of the game that felt like a more traditional board game, right? So you have, essentially these very exotic playing pieces that are made up of several miniatures on a base, but it is still basically a miniature.
Mhm.
And you get to sort of move that, across this expansive sort of battlefield. Um, there were obviously a few sort of overlays with the cardboard components. You had the tower that sort of adds just a little bit of a sort of a visual focus and a sense of three-dimensionality, just to help, sort of finish out the narrative look of the battlefield, and provide a sort of a focus for some of the scenarios.
Sure. Yeah. Was there? I mean, it just occurred to me, given that everything's a hex, was it ever a hex tower at any point, or was it always a square?
It was always a square, and and again, I know, looking back, it wasn't the easiest of things to click together,
Sure.
but the goal was to basically try and create that sense of dimension and scale in the most cost-effective way possible.
Mm.
Um, again, at that time, Games Workshop had sort of dabbled with, their sort of siege book for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. They'd done things like the Mighty Fortress. So, just having one large sort of border tower, on the board, large enough that you could put a unit on top. Again, just sort of, helped round out the sort of the play value.
Sure. Yeah. I suppose it gives you lots of different scenarios and things like that as well, doesn't it? To
Sure.
work with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you recall how well the game sort of performed commercially at the time?
Yeah, I mean, Battle Masters sort of did well. I mean, all three of the games in the sort of like the fantasy series, HeroQuest, Space Crusade, and Battle Masters, were all commercially successful. I think as a whole, what happened over time is you just get to the point where the games have been in market, they've already sort of achieved a reasonable sort of penetration in terms of how many games have been sold to who is principally the target market, and they also as a series kind of like lost their freshness, right? It's always the case with the game business. When a game first comes out, there's a spike in interest. Obviously, people, who find the game appealing, rush out and buy it. After that, sales kind of dip to something more of a sort of a yearly sort of plateau. And then over time, other games came out, in that sort of genre, so you get more competition. But I would say that of the, if memory serves me well, the three games were basically successful in the same order in which they were launched. HeroQuest was bigger than Space Crusade. Space Crusade in Europe was bigger than Battle Masters, although Battle Masters globally was bigger than Space Crusade because Battle Masters was made in the US, as well as in Europe, whereas Space Crusade was only ever launched in Europe.
Sure. Right. Yeah. And I know that sort of was around the end of your time with MB then, but there had been a couple of other sort of mooted projects. I mean, you talked before with me about the 40K version of Battle Masters that never
Yeah.
came to pass. There was another sort of chariot game that MB and Citadel were working on some miniatures for. Do you have it, even though you moved on from your perspective, was there any sort of reasons that you could see about the end of that relationship, or was it just one of the end of that era, essentially?
I think what happened is that there was basically a sort of a slowdown in the overall sort of sales. And again, it's it's the usual cycle of games, right? Typically most games don't go beyond 1 year. Games that go beyond 1 year are typically going to sort of fade away after three. A game that stays in market for 5 years with care has got the potential to become kind of an evergreen, right? A game that is going to continue to sell, at a reasonable level. And the fantasy games line that Hasbro did at the time kind of just got to that point where 4 or 5 years in, the games were still doing well, but they weren't as successful as they had been in the first couple of years. And retailers at the end of the day are always looking for something new, something that's going to drive more volume, right? They would rather deal with today's hot new game than maintain another game on shelf that is maybe 3 or 4 years old. And again, it's was a different marketplace. I mean, back in those days, nearly all of your sales are going through traditional big box retail. There's not such a big hobby market. There's certainly no e-commerce back in those days. So if you were not going to get a listing with the major high street, sort of toy accounts, then there wasn't really much commercial viability for a product. And at the end of the day, whether it's Woolworths, whether it's Argos, whether it's Tesco's, whomever it is, they've only got so much shelf space and they're only going to put so many games out. And at some point, when you get to like year 3, year 4, if you're not still driving the volume, you're going to get swapped out for something else. Sure. So I think that, what happened, and again, I have no direct knowledge on it. It's just my kind of take, is that, the partnership between Hasbro and Games Workshop had been, super successful, but for both companies. But it just got to that point where it had run its course, and there just didn't seem to be a sort of like another strong new title that would sort of reinvigorate those sales.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. It's really interesting about the sort of the economics and the longevity of games. Is that still the sort of those principles still hold true today? Is that still how it sort of works, generally speaking?
So in today's world, it's changed, a lot. First and foremost, back in the sort of like the 80s and the 90s, and again, I don't know what the exact figures are, but I'm just going to sort of throw some numbers out. The number of new games that were launched to market were probably in the hundreds, right? Maybe the thousands, but more likely the hundreds. And the reason for that is there just weren't as many publishers, first off, right? You didn't have the sort of like the huge number of sort of hobby publishers that you have in today's world. And the principal place to merchandise new games was high street sort of brick and mortar. So, and they only had so much shelf space and they could only put so many games out. So at the end of the day, that was the limiter. Contrast that with today's world, where not only have you got a much more robust sort of industry around hobby games, hobby stores, but you've also got e-commerce, you've got, Argos, Amazon, you've got this sort of, a sort of like a massive array of ways to sell product that doesn't necessarily require that you have a sort of physical placement. And interestingly, even over the last, 15 years, the importance of a Walmart or a Toys R Us, as was, or, a high street sort of store, they used to be still the sort of the primary driver for volume. But but that's slowly sort of changed.
Mm.
And e-commerce and web sales really is now the sort of like the driving force.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Not to mention, of course, you've also got the whole rise of Kickstarter and
Of course.
crowdfunding, and which is another whole sort of essentially direct to consumer business model. So the industry has changed a lot. There are many more, a lot more variety in terms of the business models. There's a huge variety of publishers out there. Hobby gaming and gaming as a hobby is, you know, significantly greater today than it was, back in the 80s.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it was fascinating. And I imagine Kickstarter throws up a lot of interesting questions in and of itself and those kind of crowdfunding platforms, because presumably you front load a lot of your potential sales. So your longevity could be affected from that kind of thing as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, and again, Kickstarter has also evolved.
Mm.
Um, when the original sort of crowdfunding, sort of came into play, it was very much, here's my sort of rough prototype, here's my sort of early version of the game. I need the crowdfunding to generate the revenue to give me the funds to go finish out the execution.
Mm.
You look at crowdfunding today, the games look more or less done, right? A lot of the artwork is complete. And again, um, the games are not actually done. There's still a lot of development, rules tweaking, all of the code and the rules typically need to be finalized and edited and all of the production files created.
Mm.
But in terms of the sculpting, the basics of the game, the artwork, all of that is sort of 80-90% complete
Mm.
because there's an expectation of that level of finish. And also there's an expectation for all of the expansions or the add-ons or the stretch goals and everything else that comes with it. Um, and the main advantage for kickstarting is, it allows a company to know how many games to make. They know
Mm.
what cash they've generated from the crowdfunding. They can kind of budget for their production run. And typically the goal is to, you know, cover all of your costs and make some profit with the Kickstarter, and then have yourself set up to supply for hobby distribution or web sales thereafter.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So jumping back into your career then, post MB, post Milton Bradley, you moved over to Bluebird, is that right?
So when I first left Hasbro in 1992, I actually set up my own little company called Games Design and Development. Um, and basically my sort of business plan was, I'm going to do a little bit of consulting and a little bit of freelance work. And then I'm going to invent games and try to develop a portfolio of products that could generate a royalty.
Mm.
And I did that for about 2.5 years, and was basically successful with the first two parts of the business, which is, I certainly found opportunities to do consulting. I certainly got a lot of freelance work. I came close to placing some games, but didn't actually manage to place anything that went to market. Um, and I'd always given myself sort of like a 2-year window. At the end of the first year, if I wasn't generating enough freelance work, I was going to reconsider. But as it turned out, I was doing perfectly well. So I went into my second year. But at the end of the second year, my goal was, if I haven't placed anything for royalty, I need to reconsider, because the freelance work is a sort of a never-ending treadmill, and doesn't have any certainty.
Right.
And also at that time, Waddington's had been bought by Hasbro, Schmidt-Spiel had been bought by Mattel, so there was a lot of my clients were being bought up by other clients. So my client base shrank. And so at that point, I decided that I really needed to get back into a full-time job, and that was when I joined Bluebird.
Right, okay. That's really interesting. Just on that sort of placing a game for royalty then. So is that literally designing a game and coming up with the whole thing and then almost selling it as a license to a company? Is that how that would have worked?
Yes, I mean, typically, back in those days, and it's not changed a great deal, but typically a game royalty is going to be in the region of 5%, and that's 5% on whatever is the net selling price that a manufacturer has when they sell to distribution or a retailer. So, you know, and typically when you sell a game in, there will be some sort of advance against royalties. Again, it varies, but it's typically a sort of a payment that is equal to 20% of the projected royalties for the first year of production.
Right.
And that's just a way of making sure that an inventor doesn't sell a game in for 5% royalty only to find out, 2 years later that the game's never going to be launched, in which
Hmm.
case you've earned nothing,
Sure.
and your game has been tied up for 2 years. So what typically happens is you sell a game, you're going to earn royalties as and when the game gets published. Upon signing the agreement, you get a 20% advance, which means that even if for whatever reason the game never goes to market,
Hmm.
you've at least got some money for your work and your time.
Right.
But it's a challenging business. I mean, there's many inventors out there. You're always vying for a limited number of slots in terms of games that publishers are looking to make. And the goal is always the same, to come up with something that is unique and compelling and has some kind of, demonstrable sort of innovation or twist on the gameplay that makes the product stand out.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So it's kind of similar to almost book publishing in a way, and authors.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I didn't realize there was that sort of economic space going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So at Bluebird, you worked on a game that I remember very well. That I remember going into my local BT's toy shop and picking up these pre-painted miniatures, essentially a science fiction miniature war game. But you bought them in entire units, and they were completely pre-painted, and it was called Havoc.
Yeah.
Right. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the creation of Havoc and where that all came from.
So at Bluebird, I worked across a whole range of different games. I worked on a little bit of Polly Pocket. I worked on Mighty Max. I worked on some of the small micro play sets that Bluebird Toys did with the Disney license.
Right.
And one of the hallmarks of, Polly Pocket and Mighty Max was you had these small little characters that had, a limited amount of deco on them, with sort of like the little painted environments within the sort of like the compact play sets.
Hmm.
And then particularly for Disney, I remember they did, Snow White and Beauty and the Beast. Disney had, much higher expectations in terms of both the quality and the precision of the paint deco that went onto the Disney characters. So when I looked at those, the first thought that ran through my head, being a lifelong, miniatures gamer, is it's like we could be making toy soldiers with deco. It's like, um, so that was really the sort of the genesis for Havoc. And what I did is I reached out to Bob Naismith, who is a sort of an X Games Workshop sculptor.
Mhm.
He was one of the key contributors to the early sculpting of the Space Marines. He was a freelance sculptor at that time. In actual fact, I had worked with Bob on other projects like Village of Fear and Dinosauria, which was another game that I had sort of done for Schmidt-Spiel. So basically partnered with Bob to come up with this sort of sci-fi sort of genre, sort of world, which we called Havoc. There was a whole sort of backstory. Um, and Bob, took the lead on the sculpting of all of the miniatures. And the intent was to have a low price tabletop miniatures game where you could buy units and the units would be fully painted. And basically, the thinking behind it was we sculpted the miniatures with the deco techniques in mind. So, and also with stickers and labels. So, oftentimes miniatures would be designed where they had at least one nice sort of clean curved area that you could put a sticker on. All of the bases were simple one peg sort of slaughter bases that you could also put a sticker on, because when you look at a miniature and you hold a miniature at arm's length, and you look down on a miniature, the largest surface area that you're looking at is the base.
Mm.
So, this is one of the tricks I always sort of found, with my own, painting. I'm not a great figure painter, but I'm good at doing bases. And what I've found over the years is that most of what you're looking at is the base. So a good base goes a long way to mitigate a poorly painted miniature. Um, so with Havoc, we basically, put four color stickers on the bases. All of the characters were molded in a cover and then given some variation of overspray, wash, sort of spot deco, spray masks, and then smaller stickers on parts of the miniature. And the reality is that, the finished result was actually very passable. There was a reality in tabletop gaming that, for every one painted miniature you've got on the table, you've probably got four or five hidden away somewhere that don't have a spot of paint on them anywhere. And Havoc was a way of basically saying, hey, they may not be the greatest figures or sort of, deco jobs in the world, but they're all painted and they all look finished.
Hmm. Yeah, indeed. I just remember it because it was fascinating to see it in the sort of toy aisles. So
Right.
you were picking up these little boxes of miniatures, an entire squad, or there would be like two troopers, two elite
Yeah.
troopers, or things like that. And there was also the starter box as well, of course. And
Yeah.
all of that was in the sort of main toy area. I was curious how it sort of like did it straddle that? Did it find a niche as an intro miniatures game with an audience of toy buyers who might not have been anywhere near Warhammer, for instance?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it was definitely sort of part of the thinking, which was um, we wanted to position this as a toy that has a game, not a game that has miniatures, right?
Right.
So and again, for Bluebird, Bluebird had a games line called the Peter Pan Games line. Um, but Bluebird as a company was actually far better known for the toys. And of those toys, obviously, Polly Pocket and Mighty Max were, sort of world-class brands. And so the thinking was, it makes a lot of sense, and retailers are going to understand that it's not a huge leap for Bluebird to say, hey, we're taking all of our skills and capabilities in doing, decorated micro toys, and we're going to make these small miniatures that are decorated that has a game system
Mm.
with it. Um, and if you think about it, the origins of tabletop gaming is, playing with toy soldiers,
Sure.
and so it was a sort of a natural fit, and it also gave us a place to give us a different placement in store. We had, I don't know if you ever remember seeing them, but we had these large cardboard display units that had all of the
Sure.
unit boxes in. And that was a great way for us to, to sell in at retail.
Yeah, because it feels like a lot of effort went into the world building and the storytelling, right? Because there were comic book tie-ins and all sorts of stuff as well,
Yeah,
wasn't there?
exactly. I mean, and unfortunately, um, who knows what might have been with Havoc. The reality is that very shortly after Havoc was launched, um, is when there was a competitive sort of takeover launched against Bluebird, which ultimately resulted in Mattel buying Bluebird. And of course, when Mattel bought Bluebird, they bought the company primarily to kind of, secure the rights worldwide for Polly Pocket and Mighty Max.
Mm.
Um, all of us who worked at Bluebird at the time knew that essentially that was the end of Bluebird as we knew it, that most of us, that would be the end of our, positions, that Bluebird as a company would be wound down. The larger, more relevant global brands would be absorbed into Mattel. But all of the other stuff, would basically be, dropped by the wayside and fall away. And obviously that was going to be true of Havoc.
Mm.
But yeah, it had there was a whole sort of comic series that was done with 2000 AD.
Sure.
So 2000 AD, basically, let me see if I can find the original one.
I
So
love that you've got the sort of archives are still collected. Look at that.
yeah, so in 2000 AD, they ran a series of sort of comics that basically ran these mini
Fantastic.
stories.
Yeah.
Um, and the mini stories were all based on the narratives that were inside each box. So when you opened a box of Havoc miniatures, you'd have a number of miniatures in there. There would be a small sticker sheet that you would use for the bases and ways to sort of customize and finish off the miniature. And then there would also be a little sort of collectible flyer, and in that flyer would be the sort of like the small sort of story for that character. So again, I've got all of the original stories and
Yes.
narratives. This is one of the battle forms
Yeah.
that we had. So as well as miniatures, there were also large sort of robots. There was a sort of like the small ground attack aircraft, and so a limited number of vehicles as well. Um, and so for all of the characters, I've got their original stories,
Oh
uh,
wow.
which was a lot of fun writing. And there was basically a whole sort of narrative in there where you had the Nexus Rebellion,
Mm.
um, who were fighting against the Khan Empire. And the Khan Empire, was at least initially in the narrative, obviously seen as the bad guys. That the Khan Empire had basically burst into our known space, had dominated and taken over. The Nexus Rebellion was, hard, fighting against the Khan, trying to kind of regain their freedom. Um, but then the little twist in it is you realize that actually the Khan Empire didn't crash into our universe as an invasion. They were actually running from something far more terrible, which were the Terravores. And the Terravores is this sort of alien race that, as the story of Havoc begins to sort of unfold, you're starting to hear stories of these vicious aliens, units in far off outposts being wiped out, even the Khan, for all of their sort of military might, also fall foul to the terrible Terror.
Sure. Yeah. It was fun. I remember it very well, and yeah, it definitely had that little moment of that potential. And it is a shame that it didn't make it. I didn't realize. I mean, now that you say it, obviously there's a clear relationship between Mighty Max, Polly Pocket, and Havoc. That kind of makes perfect sense. As a big Mighty Max fan back in the day, I didn't put two and two together back then. But yeah, fascinating.
It's always, I mean, and again, it's something that I always, look at, which is, where are there sort of manufacturing capabilities and how might those be utilized differently. So in the same way that with, Battle Masters, I basically looked at the fact that we were printing twister mats. So it's like, why can't we print a twister mat with something other than colorful dots?
Mm.
With Havoc, I was looking at, Disney approved, highly decoed little Snow White and, Beauty and the Beast. And I was immediately thought, hey, these could be toy soldiers. And, so you just connect the dots and see where it takes you.
It is fascinating how much the sort of technological sort of capabilities can play a role in pushing the envelope when it comes to sort of games innovation as well, like what's possible and things that flow from that. I mean, I suppose if we jump ahead a little bit, you took on another big project, another sort of miniature kind of skirmish game with Heroscape. And I wondered if you might sort of talk a little bit about the development of that.
Yeah, so with Heroscape was my original concept. But, I have to say, most of the game design work was actually done by folks who were part of my game team at Hasbro at the time. It was led by Craig Van Ness, who did, a lot of the design of the game and working with Rob Davio and others sort of fleshed out the story. But I basically sort of came up with the original concept. And it was basically looking at the cost of making a printed game board.
Mm.
So I calculated, how much did it cost per square inch of game board to have a game board that would be labeled with a four-color print on the surface that would then have some kind of a cambric or a textured wrap on the back, a hinge, had to go in a certain size box, versus what would the same amount of plastic cost if it was molded and just had like a single color sort of deco on it.
Mm.
And it turned out that there wasn't really a lot of difference. So in fact, if anything, the plastic was cheaper.
Right.
So, in my mind, it was like, okay, then rather than have a game board, why not make it out of plastic? And if we make it out of plastic, let's make them hexes. And if the hexes can stack, now we can create, three-dimensional terrain. And again, if I were to do it again today, I would do it differently. But for its day, Heroscape offered this infinitely sort of variable, battlescape that you could fight over. And again, going back to, my experience, I wanted to have pre-painted miniatures in there. I went to Bob Naismith, who did all of the original sculpts. So, it's the usual cast of suspects. And then in addition, I had always toyed as a miniatures gamer with the fantasy that, that most kids sort of, enjoy out of their toy box, which is what happens when toys from disparate worlds collide, right? So what happens when my G.I. Joe character, fights with a stormtrooper, right? Or, so all toys in the box can equally, combat in the sort of like the play mind. So I thought, why not have characters from all different sort of genres and sort of themes fighting amongst each other? And I had the notion of this sort of simple premise, which is, what if Valhalla was real, but the Valkyrie were not just sort of like the angels of the Norse gods? They were actually aliens, and they weren't just collecting the dead and notable from medieval sort of dark age battlefields. They were actually doing this across time and space. So, and that was the sort of the genesis, right? It was like, it's going to be multi-dimensional terrain. It's going to be a simple skirmish combat game. It's going to pitch, anyone you can think of against anyone else you can think of, and the miniatures are going to be pre-decorated. And that was the sort of the formula that we were able to sell in. And once we had sort of sold it in, that's really when I sort of turned around to Craig and I said, look, I don't have time to design this myself. I manage a team. I have other projects and things that I need to deal with, and Craig, took that thing on with a passion and developed the whole game. And he, working with Rob Davio and others, fleshed out that whole story. And that was really how Heroscape came to be.
It's fascinating to think as well that there's almost obviously there's lots of different projects that you've worked on and over the years, but almost there's like a journey from Battle Masters through Havoc into Heroscape as those ideas and certain conceptual elements and the technology behind them are sort of refined and revisited and considered again to sort of continue producing and exploring some of those same ideas in interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've always been sort of inspired by the sort of like the spectacle and the sort of the theater of games. So, I played many different types of game, but if I'm sort of honest, what appeals to me most are games that have dimension, games that have characters, games that are essentially narrative in their sort of, in their sort of structure. I like games that are, sort of fast playing. If I go back, in my youth, I played some super crunchy games, Advanced Squad Leader and Starfleet Battles and some other games that, are mind bending in terms of their rules. But the reality is that I like games that are more accessible for a whole range of reasons. But most importantly, because, I want to get to the fun as quickly as possible, and I want to have the satisfaction of finishing a game, not getting 4 turns in and then spending an hour as we pack up talking through what I was going to do and how it might have finished had we had another 6 hours. So we've all been there.
We have indeed, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different projects that you've worked on, and obviously a long legacy from a lot of those. Some of those games been revisited and are explored again. A number of them even still available in new iterations, like your HeroQuests and stuff like that. I suppose, like, is there a particular favorite when you look back at some of your work and think, that one was probably my most fun to work on?
So I definitely have a few favorites. It is sort of almost surreal in some ways to sort of see HeroQuest, back out there in the marketplace. I was, thrilled and honored to be asked by Hasbro to kind of participate a little bit in the relaunch. I got to write some additional adventures, and again, that was, they had no obligation obviously to involve me, but they did, and I'm super thankful for that. But it's also been just a great opportunity to kind of reconnect with fans of the game. So I get emails almost on a weekly basis from people who find my contact details, whether it's through LinkedIn or whatever it may be, and take the time to send me an email and say, hey, I just want you to know I played this game as a kid. It was awesome. This is what got me into hobby gaming, or this is what got me into writing, or whatever else it may be. And to be honest, it's humbling, to realize that a game that I designed all those years ago, you know, at a minimum, is something that is remembered fondly. And oftentimes people say, hey, this was the thing that led to something else. Particularly, people who found their way into game design, whether it's digital or analog, or were inspired into a lifetime of hobby gaming because they played a game that I designed. But when I look back, HeroQuest, definitely has a sort of like a sort of like a fond spot in my heart. It's, again, I can look back 35, almost 40 years later. And sure, if I was designing HeroQuest today, I would design it differently. But you have to look at the game in the context of its time, and you have to understand what HeroQuest was intended to be. And it was always intended to be a great way to enter into the hobby. It was intended to be something that just about anyone could play. And so, yes, is it simple? Is it straightforward? Does it have some limitations? Sure. But what it has that most games don't have is the flexibility and the ease of use that anyone who likes playing it can actually make it their own. They can add more rules, they can design their own adventures, they can make HeroQuest whatever they want it to be. And that's not so true with more complex games that would require a lot more work and a lot more effort to create your own adventure. It was always my intent with HeroQuest, the fact that the middle pages of the quest book are blank because I wanted people to design their own games. That was always my desire, that this would not be the end. It would be a beginning and something that people could embark on themselves.
Sure. Yeah, I imagine it's tough to, because HeroQuest is such an outsized legacy, and it is literally a phenomenon, right? It's a cultural phenomenon. I think it's fair to say. So probably it is difficult to have a favorite that isn't going to be that's going to escape from that shadow, right?
Well, and also, back in those days, again, it was a different time in terms of how games were designed and developed and what the role of a games designer was. I briefed out the box art. I had Les Edwards come to the office and I sat down and I talked through, what I wanted, and he put his ideas into, what he thought would be cool. I briefed out the graphic design agency that did all of the graphic design for the box. I briefed John Good, who was the gentleman who airbrushed the logo. And again, the original logo was a traditional piece of airbrush art, right? There was nothing digital about it. Back in those days, there just wasn't the digital sort of graphics and illustration software that is so common and prevalent today. All of that was done by hand, and John Good basically did a lot of airbrushing for the car industry. So again, back in those days, all of those beautiful photographs of cars, that was all airbrushed, and when anyone who uses Photoshop now and talks about masking and dubbing and all of these things, these are all things that you used to have to do for real as an illustrator. And John Good was amazing. And again, I think, even when I look at the logo, that logo is just sort of unforgettable. It's rich, and again, it's not crunchy and sort of hardcore. And again, no disrespect to any of those, but modern fantasy gaming, at least in part, is a little bit crunchier, a little bit sort of darker, a little bit more sort of austere, a little bit more gritty. HeroQuest is kind of high fantasy, right? It's going right back to the world of, Conan and sort of like a much more, when I say simplistic, sort of, what I mean is a sort of a more traditional sort of fantasy. Even when HeroQuest was launched, it wasn't attempting to be Lord of the Rings. It was attempting to be kind of like Warhammer Fantasy Battle in a way that everyone understands at the time. And at the time, the Conan movies were, in everyone's mind, in the same way that when we did Space Crusade, it was at a time when Aliens and RoboCop were in everyone's mind. Those were the cultural, sort of points of context that people had for both high fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah. And yeah, I think, whether it's the logo or the box or or everything really, it is truly timeless. Yeah, I think it's an incredible piece of work. But I think we could wax lyrical about HeroQuest all day. I could keep you talking, but I will let you go, Stephen. But thank you again so much for joining me to chat about your amazing career and some of the awesome work that you've done. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Jordan. It was a pleasure.
Massive thanks to Stephen Baker for joining me once again to chat about his amazing career. It was absolutely fascinating, and I had a tremendous time. There is an entire second interview with Stephen where we talk more specifically about HeroQuest and Space Crusade. That is available right now on the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel, and there are also a few stories from Stephen that we couldn't fit into any of these interviews, so that is exclusively available to my patrons via Patreon. You can check it out using the link in the description. There is lots of other early and exclusive content, including book reviews and various updates and lots of other cool stuff as well. Interviews with other folks from across the Warhammer and tabletop scene. I think it's worth checking out. You can go and have a look and be the judge, but I would love to see you over there. Whether you decide to subscribe or not, becoming a free member is really helpful too. But if you want to check it out, please do so. It would be a great help. And don't forget that you can check out my development diary, where I had unprecedented access to the creation of Stephen Baker's latest game, Saurozoic Warriors. That's available on the Jordan Sorcery channel. It is a really fascinating story to follow the creation of a game from conception through prototyping, iteration, development, and to Kickstarter. A fascinating, really super interesting story, so you can check all of that out on the main channel. Thank you once again to Stephen. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.